The voice on the baby monitor. Emily was used to being alone at night, but ever since she and her husband, Tom, had brought their baby daughter, Lily, home from the hospital, the night seemed longer, quieter, and eerier. Tom's job as a paramedic often kept him out late, and though Emily was familiar with his absence, being alone in the house with a newborn added a new layer of vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. One Friday evening, after a particularly exhausting day of caring for Lily, Emily put her to bed earlier than usual. She swaddled her daughter tightly in her favorite pink blanket, kissed her soft forehead, and laid her gently in the crib. Emily turned on the nightlight, adjusted the baby monitor on the dresser, and left the room, quietly closing the door behind her. Downstairs, Emily sank into the couch, relieved for a moment of peace. She reached for the baby monitor, checking the small screen to make sure Lily was sleeping soundly. The room on the monitor was dimly lit, with only the glow from the nightlight visible. Lily was still, the rhythmic rise and fall of her tiny chest the only movement. Emily set the monitor on the coffee table and leaned back, allowing herself to relax. As she began to doze off, a sudden crackle from the monitor jolted her awake. She sat up, staring at the screen, but everything seemed normal. Just as she was about to settle back down, she heard it, an unmistakable voice, soft and muffled, coming from the monitor. "Don't cry, little one," the voice whispered. Emily's heart stopped. She stared at the monitor in disbelief, her mind racing. The voice was low and soothing, but it wasn't hers or Tom's. And it definitely wasn't Lily's, it was a man's voice, gentle but unfamiliar. She instinctively glanced at the screen, expecting to see someone in the room, but the screen showed nothing out of the ordinary. Lily was still asleep, peaceful and undisturbed. The voice spoke again, clearer this time. There. It's all right." Emily's breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking it now, someone was in her daughter's room. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a kitchen knife, and sprinted upstairs, her mind filled with the worst possible scenarios. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her pulse echoing in her ears as she approached Lily's room. She reached the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. For a moment, she hesitated, listening intently. The house was deathly silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Taking a deep breath, Emily turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she had left it. Lily lay in her crib, still wrapped in her blanket, sound asleep. The nightlight cast a soft glow over the room, illuminating the stuffed animals lined up on the shelf and the rocking chair in the corner. Emily's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of an intruder, but there was no one there. She checked the closet, behind the curtains, under the crib, nothing. The room was empty. Confused and terrified, Emily walked over to the baby monitor on the dresser. She picked it up, staring at it as if it might offer some explanation. But the screen was blank, and the only sound was a soft crackling of static. She quickly turned it off, her hands shaking. Emily spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor by Lily's crib, the knife clutched tightly in her hand, her eyes darting around the room, waiting for any sign of movement. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made her jump. When Tom finally returned home early the next morning, he found Emily pale and exhausted, her eyes wide with fear. After hearing her story, Tom insisted on having the baby monitor checked. He didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural occurrences, but he couldn't explain what Emily had heard. They took the monitor to a local electronics store, where a technician examined it thoroughly. "There's nothing wrong with it," the technician said, shrugging. "These things can sometimes pick up stray frequencies. You might have heard a neighbor's conversation or something." But Emily knew that what she had heard wasn't a stray frequency. The voice had been inside Lily's room. She could feel it deep in her bones, the kind of certainty that leaves no room for doubt. That night, she threw the baby monitor away and never used one again. Over the years, Emily tried to push the memory of that night out of her mind, but it haunted her in quiet moments. Whenever she was alone in the house, she would catch herself listening, waiting to hear that voice again, terrified that it might one day return. The man in the window. Rachel was a typical college student, balancing her time between classes, studying, and occasional outings with friends. She lived in a small, quiet town that was known for its low crime rate and friendly atmosphere. Her parents were often away on business trips, leaving Rachel alone in the house for days at a time. It wasn't something that bothered her, she enjoyed the independence and the peace and quiet it brought. One weekend, her parents had gone on one of their frequent trips, leaving Rachel alone to study for her upcoming exams. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but Rachel didn't mind. She had a lot of material to cover, and the solitude helped her focus. As the evening wore on, she decided to take a break and grab a snack. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and as Rachel made her way there, she flicked on the lights, filling the house with a warm glow. She opened the fridge, looking for something to eat, when she felt it, a sudden, inexplicable sensation that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It was as if someone were watching her. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the kitchen was empty. Rachel shook off the feeling, convincing herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. She grabbed an apple and walked back to the living room, where her textbooks and notes were spread out on the coffee table. The large window in the living room overlooked the front yard, and as she passed by it, something outside caught her eye. She stopped, her heart skipping a beat. Standing on the other side of the window, just beyond the glass, was a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, with a hood pulled low over his face, casting it in shadow. Rachel couldn't see his features clearly, but she could feel his eyes on her, cold and unblinking. For a moment, she was frozen with fear, unable to process what she was seeing. The man stood perfectly still, his face pressed close to the glass as if trying to peer inside. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The only thing separating her from him was a thin pane of glass. Suddenly, the man raised his hand and placed it on the window. Rachel snapped out of her paralysis, stumbling backward in terror. She turned and bolted toward the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. Once there, she fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, steady, a stark contrast to Rachel's panicked gasps. There's a man outside my house, Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. He's standing at the window, watching me. Stay on the line, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Do not open any doors or windows. Find a safe place to hide until they arrive. Rachel did as she was told, ducking into the small pantry off the kitchen. She closed the door, her breathing shallow and rapid. The seconds ticked by painfully slowly as she waited, every creak of the house amplifying her fear. Outside, she could hear the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. The man was moving, but she didn't know where he was. She imagined him circling the house, looking for a way in. The thought made her sick with dread. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she heard the wail of sirens approaching. The sound filled her with relief, but also a strange sense of dread. She emerged cautiously from the pantry, peeking out the window to see flashing blue and red lights illuminating the front yard. The man was nowhere in sight. 2 police officers knocked on the front door, and Rachel hurried to let them in, her hands still shaking. They searched the property thoroughly, but found no sign of the man. The officers reassured Rachel that he was probably just a prowler, likely scared off by the approaching sirens. We'll have patrols pass by throughout the night, one of the officers said. But it's best if you stay inside and keep all the doors and windows locked. Rachel nodded, still too shaken to speak. After the officers left, she called a close friend and begged her to come over. When her friend arrived, Rachel recounted the story, her voice trembling with fear and disbelief. They stayed up all night, unable to sleep, jumping at every little noise the old house made. The next morning, Rachel's parents returned home, alarmed by what had happened. They installed new security cameras and motion sensor lights around the house, hoping to prevent something like this from happening again. But despite the added security, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the window had been watching her for much longer than just that one night. Even months later, whenever she was alone, Rachel found herself glancing out the window, half expecting to see those cold, dark eyes staring back at her. The memory of that night never left her, and she could never fully relax in her own home again. The whispering walls. Ben had always been fascinated by old houses. The way they creaked and groaned, their history hidden in every corner, made them feel alive in a way that modern buildings didn't. So when he came across an old Victorian house for sale in a remote part of the countryside, he couldn't resist. The house was large and stately, though it had clearly been neglected for years. The paint was peeling, the roof sagged in places, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. But Ben saw potential in it, a chance to restore it to its former glory. The locals in the nearby town were friendly, though they seemed somewhat wary when Ben mentioned the house. They exchanged glances and offered vague comments about its history, but no one gave him a straight answer. Ben brushed off their odd behavior as small-town superstition and set to work. The first few days in the house were uneventful. Ben spent his time cleaning, making lists of repairs, and planning the renovations. He enjoyed the solitude, the way the house felt cut off from the rest of the world. It was peaceful, a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. But soon, the peace began to feel more like isolation. The house was eerily quiet at night, the kind of quiet that made Ben hyper-aware of every little sound. The first time he heard the whispers, he was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the leaves, but there was no wind that night. He paused, straining to listen, but the sound faded away. Ben shrugged it off, convincing himself that it was just the house settling, or perhaps an animal outside. But over the next few days, the whispers became more frequent. They were never loud, always just on the edge of hearing, like voices murmuring in another room. He could never make out what they were saying, but there was a strange, unsettling cadence to them, as if they were speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The whispers followed him from room to room, growing louder as the nights passed. One evening, as he was lying in bed, the sound seemed to come from the walls themselves. He sat up, heart pounding, trying to pinpoint the source, but the voices were everywhere and nowhere at once. They seemed to shift, moving around him, surrounding him. Desperate to make sense of what was happening, Ben decided to record the sounds. He set up a digital recorder in the living room, hoping to capture the whispers on tape. The next morning, he listened to the recording, his hands trembling as he pressed play. At first, there was nothing but the soft hum of the recorder picking up the ambient noise of the house. But then, faintly, he heard it, the same low murmur that had haunted him for days. The voices were barely audible, but they were there, an unsettling mix of hissing and whispering, like a group of people speaking in hushed tones. Ben replayed the recording over and over, trying to decipher the voices, but they remained elusive, just out of reach. He began to lose sleep, lying awake at night with the recorder by his side, hoping to catch the voices in the act. But the more he listened, the more the whispers seemed to mock him, growing louder and more frantic, as if they knew he was listening. One night, as the voices grew louder, Ben snapped. He grabbed a hammer from his toolbox and started tearing down the walls in a desperate attempt to find the source of the whispers. He ripped through drywall, insulation, and wooden beams, but found nothing. The walls were empty, just as they should be. Exhausted and on the verge of a breakdown, Ben called a team of contractors to inspect the house. He told them everything, about the whispers, the strange occurrences, his growing fear that he was losing his mind. The contractors were skeptical but agreed to investigate. They spent days tearing through the house, checking the plumbing, the electrical wiring, the foundation, everything. But they found nothing unusual, nothing that could explain the sounds Ben had been hearing. The house was old, yes, but structurally sound. Defeated and terrified, Ben decided to sell the house. He couldn't bear to stay there another night, surrounded by the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The new owners were a young couple, excited to start their life in the beautiful old house. Ben didn't tell them about the whispers. He didn't want to burden them with the knowledge of what he had experienced. As Ben drove away from the house for the last time, he felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He had loved that house, but it had turned against him, filled with unseen forces that he couldn't explain. Even now, in the quiet moments before sleep, Ben could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, as if they were calling him back to the house. He never returned to that town, never looked back. But the memory of those whispers stayed with him, a haunting reminder of the things that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves.